Battalion, HHC companies, commanders, leaders, and soldiers, brothers and sisters. Chaplain Beyer here to present to you a video class. How should we then fight just war tradition for the conscientious warrior? This is something that I'm hoping will encourage you during our virtual battle assemblies, and also that others might find helpful just in thinking through not only how do we wrestle with the realities of combat as American soldiers, but as people with consciences and even as religious people, in my case, a Christian. And so this is going to be a video in which you will be asked, if you are taking this for a credit, to pause the video at certain points and answer on-screen questions that will appear to check on learning. And then you can email me those answers. My email will be at the bottom of the screen at the end to get your training credit. So let's begin. As a chaplain, I often hear soldiers tell me things like this. I've done some terrible things when I was deployed. Because of what I had to do, now I'm wrestling with my conscience and not sure what God thinks about me, what I should think about myself, how do I live with myself? And I've usually asked the question, did you commit some sort of war crime or atrocity when you were there? And the answer has always been no, in my case, but I killed. It was either them or us, that sort of thinking. And this begs the question, can a human being, even a soldier, justify killing another human? Moreover, for U.S. service members who are conscientious, those of us that are called to a high standard, professionalism and respect, we want to have sensitive and healthy consciences, and even though for those of us who are religious, even more so. So the question is, how should we then fight? How should we then train to continue to develop a moral conscience as warriors? That's the question. So soldiers in combat still want to be good people. They want to even love neighbor as self, or as Jesus Christ taught his followers, to love your enemies and bless those who curse you. How do you do that in a combat situation? How do you do that as a soldier? So today we're looking at specifically the question of justice in war. This is part of the just war tradition, which I will outline the broad strokes of it, but focus on justice in war, because there are three components to the just war tradition: justice going into war, justice in war, and justice after the war. We'll focus on in war or in combat, and how this relates to themes that I find as a Christian chaplain in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teaching of ethics, and some of the highest ethics I would submit to you, the highest ethics the world's ever seen, including the phrase from Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, where Jesus says, "You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you." And so this is a very complicated, beautiful text. And I get asked questions by this all the time by people from very different backgrounds and from very different vocations. Soldiers ask me, what do we do with this? Of course, a police officer in our church one time asked me, how do I love those who are literally cursing me, trying to bite me, punch me, and even kill me? How do I apply this? We've had young men in our church, because here on the south side of Chicago, we have young men that have been gang affiliated, that have been involved with retaliation dynamics. And one young man astutely asked me, how do I love my enemy when he's trying to shoot me? These are real questions for real people in real hard times, but I would submit that loving our enemies still applies even to warriors. It just applies differently than if someone is simply gossiping about you or slandering you. But how do we love our enemies when our job may be to stop them with deadly force if necessary? How do I love someone who is using human shields and killing children? These are some of the questions we have to wrestle with. And I want you to think about your life, your identity as a person, to be a faithful person with a conscience, and maybe even a religious person. Maybe you're following someone like myself, following Jesus, the Prince of Peace, And yet there's a vocation. As a chaplain, of course, I'm a non-combatant, but many of you might be put in harm's way at some point and called upon as a commander or a soldier, or even in your civilian life as a police officer or a judge or corrections officer, or even a lawmaker, public policy maker, to address these issues in very nuanced and hard ways. So let's get started by me giving you some assumptions that I have about war and soldiering as a profession, as a vocation. The first assumption I'm bringing to this discussion is that the Bible, the Christian scriptures, warrant warfighting as a vocation. I won't address pacifism here, but I will simply say that Jesus and John the Baptist and the Apostle Paul all gave spiritual direction to soldiers. Um, they said to soldiers, do what you do ethically. They did not say, get out of there as fast as you can out of that profession of being a soldier. But think about what John the Baptist said in Luke chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. Roman soldiers came to John the Baptist, and he said to them, well, first, tax collectors came to John, and they came to be baptized. And they said, Teacher, Rabbi, what shall we do? And John the Baptist said to them, collect no more than you're authorized to do. And then soldiers also asked him, and what shall we do? And he said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages. Okay, when you look at your LES pay schedule, be content, he says, with what you have. And don't use your authority or your power with unjust force to extort or get an edge or gain off of someone who's under your authority or at your mercy. So soldiers said, what shall we do? John did not say, leave. He says, open your MRE, look what's inside, and learn to be content and learn to be a person of character with where you are in life. He also called soldiers to repentance. And he said that the fruit of you repenting from your evil ways is to be just in soldiering, to be a person of justice, not to be a conscientious objector necessarily. Okay, and then later in the Gospels, a Roman centurion, that's a captain of 100 soldiers, came to Jesus and said, Master, my servant is paralyzed and suffering terribly. But the soldier says to Jesus, just say the word and he will be healed. This is in Matthew chapter 8, verse 10. Jesus tells this Roman army commander, I have not found such faith in all of Israel among my own Jewish brothers. He says, not to the soldier, hey, go up and get out of the Roman army, give up your commission. No, he says, go and let it be done for you as you have believed. He says, your servant will be healed. Jesus is honoring the profession and honoring the authority built into the structure and saying, that's how I will bless you, is for you to be a faithful person within your rank structure. Then later in the Bible, in the book of Acts, the early church is described in the book of Acts. And in the early church, the apostle Peter, a Jewish apostle, began a mission to the non-Jews, to the Gentiles. And he comes to a man whose name is Cornelius, who once again is a centurion, a commander of 100 soldiers. And once again, Cornelius becomes a believer, and Peter does not say to him, now it's time to choose a new profession. The profession is assumed to be honorable in the Bible. That's my first assumption. And in other religious traditions as well, for those of you that are not Christians. The number two assumption I'm bringing to this discussion is that we have dual citizenship. As a believer in Jesus, I believe that I am a citizen of this earth. Better said, maybe I'm a resident of this earth, but my true citizenship lies in heaven, in the city of God. So as I think about this, I have an identity and I have a profession. I have a faith and I have a vocation. Sunday after September 11th, 2001, after the bombings of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the crashing of United Flight 93, one pastor on the west coast of our country said this in his sermon, I'm an American first and a Christian second. And he said, bomb them back into the Stone Age. Now that is something I would not agree with, of course. Please don't quote me and say that was Chaplain Byer saying this in his video. This was another person. I think that Jesus clearly taught us to be peacemakers, to make sacrifice, etc., to love our enemies. But he did not correct or condemn soldiers who had to do their job. But that doesn't mean we have a right to have a vengeful spirit or to retaliate. And I think we always have to keep our religious identity first, and then our national identity in our profession as soldiers second. In the early church, in the early Christian church, Roman soldiers were expected to worship the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, I mean, within the empire. Uh, and yet, as they were becoming people of peace, as they were becoming followers of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, they wrestled with their conscience. What do we do now to worship God and not put the emperor in that idolatrous role? And in the 4th century after Christ, in the 4th century AD, or in the Common Era, some people would say that Constantine, uh, the Emperor Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire, established Christianity as the church of choice for the state. And then things began to change on the Christians and the military question. People began to ask, is it right for Christians to be in the military? People of peace and that sort of thing. And so uprose a great mind, a great theologian, one of the great bishops of the early church, St. Augustine of North Africa, um, in the city of Hippo. And so Augustine, one of the great minds on this, and really the fountainhead, one of the fountainheads of the just war tradition, said, God does not command the church to fight, but this is an age and a season in which Christians in government are called to execute justice, exercising justice. And in a letter to Boniface, a Roman general who had defended the post at Carthage, where Augustine lived at the time, he was a defeated general. After the defeat of Rome, Augustine wrote the book, The City of God. And in this letter to Boniface, he says essentially the same thing he says in The City of God. We are citizens of the City of God, concurrent with our status as citizens of heaven. We are earthly citizens as well. And though we will never have true peace here and now, we must strive as people of faith to gain as much approximation of that peace as we now can, as now we might enjoy. But he says to Boniface the general, stay in your post as a commander of the army and do the very best you can as a man of faith, as a man of conscience. He says, using examples, if judges are bribed and they are unjust judges and they're harsh judges, should all the Christians say, well, then I'm not going to dirty myself with becoming a judge and taking that vocation? No, he says they should enter the profession with integrity and make an effort to pursue true justice and change the reputation. Same for tax collectors, police officers, correction officers, even soldiers. So my second assumption is that we are citizens of two kingdoms, two worlds, and we should be the best and most conscientious as we let our faith inform our work in this world. The third assumption I'm bringing to the table today is that war is never good, but it may be necessary. War is never good, but it may be necessary. In the ancient wisdom book of Ecclesiastes, in the Hebrew scriptures, we read there's a season for every purpose under heaven, a time for war and a time for peace. So no war should be considered good, but just war is the goal when we must go to war. There's a distinction between just and unjust war in this Christian tradition and in this religious tradition of the just war. There's no perfectly just war, of course, so people might say, well, because we can never wage a perfect war, we shouldn't go to war at all. But there are no perfect people. Should there be no people? There are no perfect platoons, no perfect political institutions or political states. But shouldn't we try to reach that closer state of conscious effort to be people of peace and people of love and goodwill? The parallel of war not being good but necessary is another assumption I'm bringing within the same category, which is that the state must use force when necessary to uphold the law. But there's a difference between force and violence. Violence is something against the law. It's something immoral or unjust. It's something against the good political order. But force is what the state must use and its agents like soldiers and police officers to uphold the law. Force is only used when absolutely necessary to serve the greater goal of peace and justice in society and in the world. There's a distinction here in this category between thou shalt not murder and lawful killing. So the sixth commandment of the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not murder. Some people think it's just do not kill, but that's the word is distinct from kill and murder. Killing would be something that the state has been given authority by God to do, whether it's justice in a courtroom and capital punishment, or whether it is justice on a battlefield and using deadly force to destroy an enemy. But thou shalt not murder, premeditated murder, a personal vendetta or vengeance, these are the things that are forbidden in the scriptures. And so murder would be in that category of violence, injustice, it's unjustified, it's It's an injustice. But combat force is state sanctioned and justified, and we need to root that in the just war tradition to make sure that we have proper justification. Romans 13 is another New Testament letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, and in that he says that God ordains the state to wield the sword, to be the agent of force. So killing in war may be necessary, unwanted, but necessary. Murder is never warranted. My fourth assumption that I bring to this discussion today is that war is an ultimate laboratory and proving ground for our character, our conscience, even if you're a Christian, for being a disciple, that sort of thing. The late Jean Bethke-Elshtain, a University of Chicago professor of social and political ethics, said this: war puts people in extreme situations. It's a human laboratory. Will they react nobly and with decency, or horrifically? We've heard it said war is hell. Of course, it's not literally hell, but it is terrible. And all is not fair in love and war, but there are rules to keep things more fair than not and more just than not. I really have appreciated the book that's titled Just War as Christian Discipleship by the author Daniel Bell. And in this, he says that just war is not a public policy checklist on the eve of war, just to make sure that we pat ourselves on the back and feel good about declaring war on someone, but just war is a church discipleship issue. It's a character issue. It's a conscience issue. Warriors cannot be given a checklist or just a little card to put in their wallet and say, here are the rules of engagement, but they need to experience character formation and training, and that's why I'm offering one resource as this video today, and I encourage you to continue to study this, and I could recommend other books and resources for you. There's the golden rule of character formation, which is do to others what you want them to do to you. That's something that Jesus taught in the New Testament. It's become a popular slogan, and it's better than the other rule, which you could say is maybe a tarnished golden rule or maybe a silver rule. It's like don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Okay, but Jesus does one better than this when he teaches do to others what you want them to do to you. And then he says, beyond that, love your enemies with an undeserved grace and mercy that reflects God's love for you. Show justice to the oppressed. Defend people who are victims. Don't let other people take advantage of the weak. You wouldn't want someone to do that to you or your family, so power thus far has protected you and been used in your favor. Use power to protect others. Use power to protect your comrades, your brother and sister on the battlefield. This fulfills the golden rule. It fulfills the law commandment. It shows that you're a person of character. When you do what Jesus taught in John 15, no greater love is there than this, than a man would lay down his life for his friends. Lay down his life for those that have immediate allegiance to this person's heart, the closest neighbor, the closest in the concentric circle of who my neighbor might be. But love doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop just with who I love and who I'm like and who likes me, but it goes beyond that to love for enemy. This is a complicated part of the discussion when we ask, how can we still maintain love in our heart when we may have to use deadly force to stop an enemy? Well, let me quote St. Augustine again, who says that love is sometimes used to restrain violence and creating more victims. So if you love your enemy, you may have to put them down so that they don't continue to multiply violence and create more victims in the world. He says, though defensive violence will always be a sad necessity in the eyes of men of principle, it would be still more unfortunate if wrongdoers should dominate just men. We don't want unjust, evil people to proliferate at the expense of good and decent people of justice. But that leads to my next and final assumption that I want to make before I do a quick sketch of the just war tradition, which is we are all bringing to this discussion the assumption of a relative righteousness. What I mean by that is I'm not perfect, I'm not a fully righteous person, and I can't look at my enemy and say, you're the only problem, and I'm completely justified in feeling and thinking that you're pure evil and that I'm pure good. I'm never fully just in any situation. But in a particular power dynamic, in a particular discrete situation, maybe compared to my enemy, I am more righteous in this argument or in this debate or in this war. But I always carry with me, as a person of character and conscience, a sense of humility, not self-righteousness. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he's teaching us that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the best of the religious leaders, you'll never enter his kingdom. So we always have to carry a humility that says, I'm never as good as I sometimes think I am. I always want to be humble. And Michael Walzer, who's really the godfather of the just war tradition today, and he's written a definitive book that many use as the standard today, Michael Walzer argues against self-righteousness in his book, Just and Unjust War. He says, in war, if you're convinced of your justice, there's a temptation that erodes the protections that the just war conventions provide. So he says, don't be convinced absolutely that you're completely right, 100%, and could do no wrong. He says, keep a humble attitude. Don't have this vindictive, retaliatory attitude that says they deserve to pay and I'm going to be the punisher. You will be called on, perhaps, to stop an enemy who's doing injustices with deadly force, but still maintain your character, maintain your consciousness. Do it in self-defense. Do it in a reluctant spirit, but a necessary spirit. Confess any hate that you have in your heart. Seek the ultimate good of other people on the other side of the divide. That's the attitude. We're going to pause the video here, and I'm going to have a question for you. And so would you take a moment to think about this question, write your answer, then you can resume the video at that point. Okay, now that you've answered that question, let's move into what is just war tradition, a brief sketch. First, just war tradition is not a unified theory, so I'm presenting to you some elements. There are, of course, variations of this, but it's a complex stream of tradition from ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, who first coined the term just war in the 300s BC, but it's mainly flowing through St. Augustine, who I've already mentioned, then St. Thomas Aquinas, Grotius, Paul Ramsey, Michael Walzer in current thought. So let's just start with a really brief look at what is justice before war, then we'll look at justice in war, then finally we'll look at justice after the war, and we'll spend most of our time in the justice in war. So the Latin, which I'll put on the screen for you, for justice going into war is jus ad bellum, justice going into war. It's the conditions leading up to a just war. The first of those is legitimate authority. So when we think about what gives us the right to go into war, we need to ask, what authority do we have? Is it legitimate? Think of the Crusades, that period of church history where Christians were fighting Muslims and Jews, and they were killing one another in the name of religion, which is not the church's role. It's not supposed to be the role of a religion. So that would not be legitimate authority. Think about guerrilla warfare or insurgent groups, terrorists even, who declare war for their cause that's not connected to a state authority. That's not a legitimate authority. Think about legitimate authority in some of the wars we've fought. It is complicated. Sometimes there are good reasons, and then sometimes we wonder, is there a subtext? Are there other reasons to it? And it usually is not a perfect airtight case. The second justice into war, going into war question is there just cause for this? Self-defense is a just cause. United Nations Article 51 states that very clearly, that a state can defend itself when it comes under attack. It can also help another state to defend in a humanitarian crisis if it is under attack. So the reasons for just cause could be thought of as 3 R's: repelling, recovering, and restoring. So to repel an attack, to defend against an oncoming attack, repel. Secondly, recover. If things have been taken from a nation unjustly, you can recover lost goods or even people. If there, thirdly, is something that needs to be restored in the sense of moral order, or a punishment that's happened for a crime to deter further injustices like that from happening. So restoring of moral order. So repel, recover, restore. Those are reasons for just cause in war. Religious differences between cultural groups or nations is not a just cause for war. Perhaps to protect a persecuted group, yes, but not just because we have religious differences. Preemptive strikes are usually not considered just cause unless there's an imminent grave threat. Simply to say we're going to prevent some future distant threat from happening is not usually seen as a just cause. in the just war tradition. And then thirdly, right intent. Do we have the right intent going into this war? Are we going to simply uh, make right a wrong to establish peace greater than what we have before the war or during this present time? Just war must seek with the right intent the common good. That includes the idea of love for enemy, as we've talked about. Not just justice for me, not just what's in it for me. Will this increase my uh, gross national product? St. Augustine said, war is always fought for peace, but also it must be a just peace. Not just a peace for the conquering side so they can live peacefully at the expense of other people, but a justly ordered peace, a peace that's the fruit of justice and righteousness. The fourth reason going into war would be considered legitimate is probability of success. Probability of success. Can we win? We have to consider this. We can't predict it, of course, but we have to count the cost, so to speak. If you can't win, don't start the war. There's a moral imperative of surrender. If we realize we cannot win once we're in, then we must surrender or leave the nation that we're fighting against. Probability of success is a criteria for justice going into war. And then the final criteria that we'll look at is last resort. Is this war a last resort? This idea is not as popular today in public policy. Striking back for strategic advantage is something looked highly upon. But the question is, can we do any sort of earnest diplomacy? Can we pay attention to any other alternative to war? And if all those conditions are met and it's still not successful, then just war may be waged. So the theologian and just war theorist Paul Ramsey says that there are twins, like twins that are born of a mother. There's a justification for war, which also serves at the very same time as limitations in just war. So these very reasons that we put the brakes on, we pump the brakes and say, let's not be hasty in going into war, those very things also govern and guide and guard us to maintain justice in war, which we'll look at next. Let's pause the video here. I'll have a question for you, and then you can resume in just a minute. So now we'll discuss justice in war, or the Latin is jus in bellum, justice in war. These are the foundations for the rules of engagement as we know them in combat, the ethical foundations at least. There are two criteria for justice in war: distinction and proportionality. Distinction, let's look at that first. Distinction also is called discrimination. Doesn't mean we're discriminating against people. It means we're discriminating our targets. What are valid targets, militarily speaking, and what are targets that are off limits, civilians, those sorts of things. So if you see a soldier wearing a uniform, carrying a weapon, fighting in a battle against you, that's an obvious, legitimate target. But we discriminate and say that we would not target civilians. We make a distinction. Civilians, even if they're in the target area, should not be in the scope of a rifle or within the blast radius of an attack. We even have to wrestle with questions of what about disarmed enemy forces? Is there a necessity to kill them? If the enemy is showering or spotted helping a child across the street, are they a legitimate target at that point if they're not actively engaged in a battle with us? Or clearly conspiring and gathering materials and on their way to destroy Allied forces. So the question has an even broader scope than that, and the concentric circles continue to expand, and you ask, what about those who are providing material support for these enemy combatants? The politicians who declare war, those who manufacture the tanks and the ammunition, those who work in the kitchen feeding the soldiers. Typically, just war theory says, yes, these are legitimate targets if they are in a battlefield area conducting their business, even if they're not physically attacking us. What about religious institutions, cultural sites? Are they legitimate targets? Distinction says no. These are not, unless they're used for cover or shelter or staging military operations or storage of ammunition and that sort of thing. So a great example of this was in January of 2020 when the United States used a drone strike to kill Iranian General Soleimani, and Secretary of Defense Mark Esper reassured the Iranian foreign minister we will follow the rules of the laws of armed conflict, he said, reassuring him that we will not strike civilians and cultural targets and that sort of thing. Discrimination, distinction, that's um, a very important part of justice in battle, in war, in a combat zone. Public policy kind of relativizes the necessity for strikes, and in its main banner is intentionality. What is intention? What is our intention here? Or do we try to kill civilians? No. Collateral damage, they would say. But just war tradition goes deeper than this. It's not just what was our intention, but it's um, what are we going to do on the positive side to protect civilians and to ensure that we're not using unnecessary force, that we're choosing rightly our weapons. And that's what really proportionality is about, which we'll look at in a minute. But when we think about discrimination, um, let's say that we drop a bomb in an area and the blast radius happens to kill civilians. There's a phrase called double effect. Unintended consequences. We didn't mean to kill the civilians, but there's a double effect, meaning what was military necessity, we had to destroy the enemy, may lead to unintentional consequences of civilian casualties. Um, but in the just war tradition, from a Christian perspective, we include this sense of looking out for our neighbor or even loving our neighbor actively. We are seeking to preserve the lives of the civilians, not just say, oh, well, it was unintentional. We happened to destroy um, some civilians, some children, some hospitals along the way. But if we have weapons available at the time of the attack to strike the enemy and kill them with precision, then by all means, we are justified in doing so. If we think that we might be killing civilians in the process, then we should probably wait until we have something more precise or choose another weapon in order to protect life. It's not a permission of allowing death. It's a protection of life on a more positive side of the ledger. Thomas Aquinas, the theologian, said in some of his thinking on just war tradition, he said, imagine an example of a woodcutter in a forest, chopping down trees. In a low populated forest where you don't expect people to be walking through or to be living, the woodcutter can chop a tree down, and if it happens to fall on a person, he's not to blame. But if you're living in a high population area where people live and constantly are walking through the woods, then this woodcutter would be held responsible if he chops a tree down and it falls on a child or a passerby. This is the idea of discrimination. We want to hold ourselves accountable to choose only military targets and to preserve and protect life wherever possible. As we continue to look at justice in war, we look at the second criteria for justice in combat, which is proportionality. Proportionality is the idea that we provide eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth type justice, not that we have small arms fire coming at us and then we drop a nuclear bomb on a village. It's about keeping collateral damage to a minimum. It's about not wasting resources or human lives on either side of the lines of battle. Proportionality is about using economy of force. It's concerned with both the end of the battle and the means to get there. It's concerned with both the objective and the way that we achieve the objective. So proportionality deals with directing our focus at the end of the main objective and not wasting resources on secondary targets. Okay, that's part of it. But in the just war tradition, it means we also look at the means of how we're going to achieve that main objective, and we use measured means, measured force. We limit our force to only what's necessary to achieve a just end, an end that would give us justice and that would allow us to have validation and to be people of a conscience. So let me quote Daniel Bell again from his book. He says, the expectation that a just war people will employ the minimum force necessary is an expression of the positive commitment of just warriors. And he's talking about just warriors in a Christian tradition who love their enemies and intend, even in the midst of war, not just the death and destruction of the enemy, but we would intend their turning and sharing in the benefits of a just peace. So we're not just trying to destroy enemy combatants. We're hoping for the end result to be, and we're using means as much as possible to turn the people to a just peace. Paul Ramsey, another just war theorist, says it like this: the objective of combat is the incapacitation of a combatant, to stop the enemy combatant from harming us in this particular war. But it's not simply the killing of a man. Our objective is not simply to kill the other side, it's to render them incapable from harming us. However, we must do that. And in the just war tradition, this idea of proportionality and even discrimination, as we looked at before, require patience. Patience is not something that politicians or public policy architects may be considering much in their deliberations. But patience is because a just application of justice in war could perhaps prolong wars. So patience is needed both in military and civilian processing of what a war is. We could certainly shock and awe and wreak mass destruction and overwhelm the enemy indiscriminately, ending a war much more quickly, but we would be violating justice. We would be violating the principles of just war and violating our consciences. So patience is necessary, but patience might lead to pain. It might lead to pain on our side. It might lead us to say, if we're going to be consistent with the principles of just war, we may have to realize that this might be a sacrifice on our side in some way. We might be taking risks and risking American lives even. But I think that the risk is worth it for a clean conscience, depending on the situation. You may have to personally wrestle with, am I willing to live with myself by violating my conscience or violating the laws of warfare or even the just war tradition? Michael Walzer in his book says that there are cases in which there might be a supreme emergency, a national emergency. And in this supreme emergency, this mother of all emergencies, a community might think that our whole existence is threatened, and we might be wiped out if we do not suspend or violate some of just war criteria in order to survive. What he's saying is we might have to bend the rules some or violate our own conscience or our own policies or our own traditions. But then the question is, are we still acting justly if we violate these conditions because we feel threatened? Truly, we must keep all the just war criteria on the table. And this might lead to some suffering or some pain. To be consistent with our values, it might limit some of our comforts. It might even limit some of our rights for what we think we have a right to deserve. But this is when Michael Walzer comes back, and there's a balance to his supreme emergency in his own writing when he says we must also offer and provide due care. We must provide due care to limit harm against civilians, non-combatants. Soldiers must assume some risk to their own selves, their own bodies, their own comrades, their own units in doing this, because we are constrained by justice. We're constrained by only what is necessary. Let me pause the video again for another question before we move into the final area of justice after war. This final brief section is just a quick sketch of outlining what does justice after war look like. Jus post bellum is the Latin. I just want to name a few things quickly and then move to a conclusion. First, there's reparations that might be needed, reparations that might be due because we have destroyed things and we can rebuild those things, or maybe it's an act of grace and mercy in which we're showing compassion for people that have much worse economy or infrastructures, things like that. Justice after the war also might mean settlements in the war, giving settlements to people who have lost. We would provide for them so they can rebuild their lives. It's relief efforts. It's relief efforts to the impoverished, the poor, widows or orphans, those sorts of things, rebuilding schools, hospitals, communities, even nations, as we've done in our history. But I don't have the time to talk in depth about justice after the war. I really want to focus on what can you do as a warrior with a conscience with this just war tradition. So let me just conclude by saying something brief about you personally. The person of conscience in a context of war faces a very high bar. Okay, I know I'm setting out things there that are many ideals and principles, and they echo the statements of Jesus that I've quoted about loving your enemy and blessing people who are cursing you. And I would just say that there's not an impossibility to this, though, that when a person of faith believes in a God whose love is so wide and so grand, and his love is being poured out mercifully into our hearts when we don't deserve it, then we begin to see ourselves in that humble way, not that self-righteous way. We begin to see our neighbor as someone made in God's image. It becomes possible to love someone who has even declared themselves to be our enemy. It becomes possible to show them goodwill and hope for the best and pray for the best case scenario, for a just peace, even for them. And there are certain risks that we would take on when we live that sort of lifestyle. Just wars can be lost. Just warriors do die in battle, sometimes even because they're choosing to risk their lives to uphold values that they have, knowing that the enemy may not share those same values or care about them. And so justice in this life and just war in this life must be seen in the shadows of the true justice that will only come in the final day, when God will hold people accountable for their actions, whether in civilian life or in war. And so I believe there's a resurrection when people will be brought back and given account for what they've done in this life. And I trust and I believe that I will be judged for what I do now then. And in the face of potential loss to earthly goods, I believe I'm going to get a greater gain, and that all accounts will be settled. And I believe it's worth living a moral life and maintaining a good conscience and having a good character in light of even the atrocities and the evils we see all around us. And I'm not asking you to just watch this video today and say, well, I can check off that I got some credit for it and moving on now. I want you to consider the character formation needed so that you're not just going to be faced on the battlefield one day with the ultimate test of your life in this human laboratory of war. But I want you to think, what can I do now to an ongoing engagement, forming my soul, forming my character as a person of justice, a person who is acting more lovingly than not. Working on my intentions, even in small ways, with my family, with my commanders, with my coworkers, with my neighbors. When someone hurts me, not to retaliate in anger, but to learn to forgive and be patient, to be a person of peace, to learn what righteous anger means, that I can have rage against what's wrong and what's terrible in this world, but I can still recognize the humanity in other people and seek to limit the harm that I would do to them. I want to seek wise counselors and people of faith, people of moral character that I can learn from. I can have models and mentors and counselors, whether when in churches or volunteer organizations or political groups, people who can ask me hard questions and that I can learn and sharpen my skills and my understanding of this. And I just want to close by saying, I hope that if you, like some of the soldiers I've counseled or the first responders and people on the front lines of even civilian work, have done something that you regret, that you feel is crossing the moral line, then there is a way to repent of that. There's a way to turn from that. There's a way to properly lament those things and have those moral injuries upon your soul forgiven and covered. And so I would invite you to be in touch with me if you feel that you've done something like that, and that you would take advantage of the resources available to help you move forward in life so that you can experience the peace that I'm promoting we would offer to all people, even as warriors of conscience. So I hope this has been helpful for you. Please feel free to ask questions. You can write comments at the bottom of the video or just reach out to me directly through my email that I'm going to provide here. And this is also the email that you can send the answers to your questions. And I'll give you one final question here at the end. But it's been a pleasure to provide this material for you, and I hope that we can have more fruitful discussions in person on that once the coronavirus is a thing of the past. So peace be upon you. Chaplain Byer out.